The last place most people think about when the Second World War comes up are the Faroe Islands. In fact, most people don't really think about them too much at all, but I was recently there, and so I'm going to be looking in a few videos at the Faroe Islands, and in this one about the Faroe Islands in the Second World War, because who on earth would invade a place like the Faroe Islands just for the hell of it? Some context is probably required here. So the year is 1940, and Denmark is invaded by Nazi Germany. While the Danes put up a heroic fight, within the day they are subdued by the Germans, and this is the official start of the occupation of Denmark. Now at the time, the Faroe Islands were part of the Danish Empire. They had some level of autonomy and had done so for quite some time, but they were still part of Denmark. So now the question remained, now that Denmark had fallen, what would happen with the Faroe Islands? Well, to many of us it might look like the Faroe Islands are out in the middle of the ocean, in the middle of nowhere, and might not serve much of a strategic vantage point. In actual fact, now that Denmark and Norway had both been occupied by the Germans, they were looking across the North Atlantic to gain a foothold there for the invasion of Britain, which both sides, the Allies and the Axis, were sure was going to come. It would also be a great point from which to launch German U-boat attacks in the North Atlantic to stop supplies coming into Britain. So, what were the British to do? Well, in the House of Commons, by none other than Winston Churchill himself, who at that time was the First Lord of the Admiralty, he said on the 11th of April that we are also at this moment occupying the Faroe Islands, which belong to Denmark and which are a strategic point of high importance, and whose people showed every disposition to receive us with warm regard. We shall shield the Faroe Islands from all the severities of war and establish ourselves there conveniently by sea and air until the moment comes when they will be handed back to Denmark, liberated from the foul thraldom into which they have been plunged by German aggression. So it was clear that the British were going to make a move onto the Faroe Islands, and as it's stated here, this isn't simple old school imperialism, which the British were kind of having enough of by this time, but it was to stop it from falling into German hands. I will also highlight the word thraldom, which I particularly like the fact that Churchill has used this here, whether he's aware of the fact that this was a word coming from thrælar in Old Norse, which means something like slave or bondsman, and has then been brought into English, but it's a particularly fitting word for the Faroe Islands. So on the 12th of April, the day after 1940, there was sighted in the bay, there was an RAF pilot that had come the day before and flown over Tórshavn, the capital, and then two British destroyers would become the first part of Operation Valentine, the operation to secure the Faroe Islands. They sailed into Tórshavn on the 12th of April, and the next day they were accompanied by a battle cruiser as well. Sailing into the capital, into the harbour, the people were very excited. They knew that something was happening, but not exactly sure what. So at the time, the main guy in charge on the island, the Danish guy, and of course you will notice has a very good name, Karl Eger Hilbert. This is the first other Hilbert that we are covering on this channel. You see, it's not just me called Hilbert, but here it's a surname. He was the guy in charge at the time, and he went and he met with the British forces and decided to hand over control as long as the British didn't get involved with the internal affairs. So the British would garrison the Faroe Islands, and that would be that. An emergency meeting of the Løgting, so this is the Faroese council that ruled on the islands, was called, and while some members, they wanted to declare independence, there was a strong nationalistic movement on the Faroe Islands, and still is today, from Denmark, they actually were outvoted and decided to simply cooperate with the British, which is what they did. Now, the British moved in troops. At first they moved in a force of several hundred Royal Marines, but these were later replaced by several Scottish regiments that would do different turns on the islands, which proved to not be as strenuous a task as invading Europe and doing other things, so it wasn't too bad a place. And there's even a book that's been written by one of the soldiers that you can find if you want to read about what life was like on the Faroe Islands for those soldiers who were stationed there. Now, it wasn't without action, and this is because on the 20th of June 1940, 4 Swedish battleships sailed into the Faroe Islands. However, the British decided to confiscate them. Now, this might be a little weird because if you know about the Second World War, Sweden was neutral, so it wasn't one of the enemy powers. However, the fact that Sweden was neutral, it meant that these ships would have to pass through the other Scandinavian countries nearby Denmark and Norway, which had both been occupied by the Germans. And so the British were worried that if they let these ships go, they would be captured by the Germans, by the Navy, by the Kriegsmarine, and then they would be used against them. However, they did in the end take them back to the Shetland Islands in Britain and then let them go on when they were assured that they wouldn't fall into German hands. The British military presence on the island was greatly reduced in 1944 when they realised that the Germans were no longer posing a great threat as they started to be defeated around Europe. Now, what mostly the fighting that would have been seen on the islands was a few attacks by the Luftwaffe, but there was nothing particularly serious. It wasn't a main target for the Germans as cities in Britain were, for example. Now, one of the greatest incidents that occurred was the sinking of a Faroese ship called the Nujaberg, and this ship was sunk and many lives were lost. Something like 200 lives were lost during the war from the Faroe Islands, largely because of shipping. They were bringing in supplies, and obviously the Germans with U-boats and with Luftwaffe planes were trying to bring down the boats to stop the supplies from coming in, and this was a really great loss of life borne by the Faroe Islands. And actually, when on the islands, they had to keep using the Danish krone, which is the currency. But because Denmark had been occupied, they had to get these krone stamped. And actually, in Britain, they started to print off krone just to be used on the Faroe Islands because they needed to continue. And you can see this one is an old one from 1937, but then it's been stamped over and it says it can be used on the Faroe Islands in the Faroe district, June 1940. So it's very interesting that that has remained the economic side of the war on the Faroe Islands when it was occupied by the British. There were also 170 marriages between British servicemen and Faroese women, so obviously many people in the Faroe Islands today have British ancestry, British surnames, and this wasn't the only cultural thing that stuck around. Valgar is the only place you can fly into on the Faroe Islands. Now, the reason is because the British actually made the runway for their own planes to come in, and so a lot of the work that was done by the servicemen on the Faroe Islands station there was actually to make the runway, and in the 60s the Faroese decided to start using it again, and actually when I went into the Faroe Islands, that's where you land because of this presence. You can also see that the love of British tea, fish and chips, and Cadbury's chocolates, which you can buy in the Faroe Islands but not in Denmark, is also because of this British connection that they had during the war. The years of occupation were also important for how the Faroese viewed themselves. Now, as I already said, the Løgting, initially there were members who wanted to go straight for independence, and this actually grew during the time of British occupation. This is because in 1944, the British allowed the Icelanders, so Iceland had also been a similar situation to the Faroe Islands, a colony of Denmark, to become independent. And there were lots of voices in the Faroe Islands that they wanted the British to do the same, that they could become fully independent from the British as well in their islands. But this never happened. Now, when the British left in 1945, a year later in 1946, the Løgting held what was considered by Denmark to be an illegal referendum on independence from Denmark in the Faroe Islands, and they got the yes vote by quite a large margin. However, the Danish never recognized this, and to this day the Faroes remain an autonomous region within Denmark. Despite the fact that many in the Faroe Islands, I'm not sure if it's a majority, but there are certainly voices for it, want full independence. But this period of the British occupation then has been a very important one in the last century for the people of the Faroe Islands. You can see here from 2005 a postage stamp that remembers the British time there, and there's also several monuments around the island. So you can see the fort in Tórshavn up on the hill that was built by the British to defend it, as well as of course the runway at the airport there. Alright everyone, thank you very much for watching this video. I thought it's a really weird little topic, but because I've just been in the Faroe Islands, I knew that Iceland had been occupied during the Second World War by the British, but didn't know that the same had been the case for the Faroe Islands, so I decided to make this little video. I'm going to make another one like this on the occupation of Iceland, because that actually went really quite differently to what the British were doing on the Faroes. Now, they were very well received here in Iceland, bit of a different story, and you've got the later Cod Wars as well, so I thought that might be fun to look at, because I normally look at these places like Iceland and the Faroes in the Viking Age and then never again, but it's fun to look at them again. So thank you very much for watching this video on the Faroe Islands. Let me know if you liked it in the comments below, give me a thumbs up if you did enjoy it, and I will see you next time. I've been Hilbert, and this has been The History.